Hello, my name is Marion Barnes, and I work at in the Strategic Communication and Marketing Department here at Western Oregon University. I know many of you have been on the opposite side of my voice recorder, as I've interviewed you in the last year and a half here on campus. Um, and So, in addition to that, though, I am also enrolled in grad school at the University of Oregon. And one of my focuses while I've been in grad school is studying Generation Z. And that's why I know a lot of stuff about those group of people. So, as part of my research on Generation Z, um, uh, I've found that they're going to be a particularly interesting group of people. And you might be confused about, like, well, who is Generation Z? Well, they're already in our classrooms, and there's going to be more on the way. Um, so we're just going to kind of go over that and discuss what that's going to look like and some possible, tools to help you with that. But first, I'd like to do kind of like a disclaimer about generations because I know that some people don't necessarily feel like they identify with their generation, and so I don't want to make I want to acknowledge that it's not really fair to put everybody into one basket to paint huge populations with the same big brush, so to say. Uh, so we can kind of look at the statistics for that because approximately for my research, I've been able to tell that about 75 to 85% of people actually like identify with their generational traits and characteristics, um, whereas the remaining 25% may feel uh, completely differently, that they don't identify with their generation at all. So, what does that 25% do, basically? So, like for example, one of my coworkers the other day was telling me that technically they are a millennial, but they don't identify that way. Like they don't feel like they can match with any of those um, categories. So basically, the message is to take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt. Um, so um, a basic um, overview of uh, the the generations that I'd like to go over with you guys um, is that you can kind of see um, that generation, the greatest generation, is kind of like the first one that we're looking at. This is just like the broad overview of all of the generations that we've kind of studied over the past few years, um, and the greatest generation, was ranging from the years 1900 to 1925. They are the World War II people, um, and um, they are kind of grouped into that year. And then next we have the silent generation, and that group of people were born from 1926 to 1943. They grew up in the Depression era and experienced a lot of hardship. That was people from after World War II um, growing up with a lot of difficulty in their life. And so then the next generation after that, we have the baby boomers from 1944 to 1964. Um, and then after that, we have Generation X, my group of people, and they were born from 1965 to 1979. And then right after that, we have the Millennials. They were born from 1980 to 1994. All right. So now, how many people do we have in the room who belong to? How many of you guys are baby boomers? Okay, a few hands. What about Gen Xers? Okay, okay, got my people in here. And then what about millennials? Okay, great. Yeah, so it looks like we have a pretty good chunk of each from each group here. Um, so something that's actually really interesting that I found in my research is that by the year 2020, Generation Z is going to make up 40% of consumers. It's going to be a really diverse set of consumers. Um, and so it's going to be that, and that might seem shocking to you that, by 2020, 40% of, the consumers is going to be Generation Z, but that's just the way it's going to play out. Um, so something that you guys may have heard about Generation Z is that they are millennials on steroids. Um, and that's actually kind of a false claim. The generation that they're closest to out of all of the generations is the silent generation. Um, and it's because, if you look at the events that happened uh, from both generational, periods of time, the silent generation had to go through World War II and kind of the Great Depression era, and then um, Generation Z had to, they were alive during 9/11, and they share a lot of the same values that the silent generation does. For example, the silent generation has very strong family values, whereas the Generation Z has very strong values placed on independence. Um, so moving on, I want to kind of look at the uh, similarities and differences between millennials and Generation Z because people think that they are so similar. But really, one of the biggest differences between them is that millennials, they did grow up with technology, but they grew up while it was coming out. So they had to kind of learn on the go how to use technology, whereas Generation Z have been playing with iPads since they were one, unfortunately. Um, so some of the other things that Generation Z, some of the other traits that Generation Z has is social media has a very large influence. Some of the most highly used social media platforms that they use are Snapchat, Instagram, and Whisper. And I had to look up what Whisper was the other day because I didn't really know, but it's making a huge surge in usage. Um, and another thing that seems to be really interesting about Generation Z is privacy issues. Because people will always say, like, oh, be careful about what you post online because, your future employers could see it at any time. Whereas Generation Z kind of seems to be under the impression that, well, there's all this other information out there that people can access at any time. So, what the heck? Why not? Um, and I just think that's really interesting. So some of the other attributes that Generation Z has is that they value streaming services over cable. Like cable doesn't exist anymore. For example, like my kids cut the cord with cable. It's all about YouTube, Hulu, and those kinds of streaming platforms rather than having an infinite number of channels. They tend to be homebodies. I can say as a mother with two teenage aged kids, they have no problem staying in their room and just kind of hanging out. So they don't really go outside and play as much, and I guess that kind of coincided with when they became a certain age and got a cell phone. So they're very comfortable, just kind of like staying in one spot and hanging out. Um, and Generation Z kids were raised by Generation Xers. Um, and one of the biggest differences that I've noticed is that millennials and Generation X parents, Generation X parents, they do value safety a lot, but they don't tend to be the helicopter parents that millennial parents have kind of shown to be over the years. Um, and so yeah, there's that difference. And then Generation Z also very much values their free time. They and free time for them usually just means being on their phone. Generation Z is also an extremely pragmatic generation. They're able to think very logically and quickly. And this is another interesting thing about Generation Z that many people tend to say that Generation Z has, the 8 second attention span, very short attention span, when actually it is the complete opposite. So it may seem like they have a short attention span, but really what they're doing is they have a very quick processing time in their brain. So they are able to look at something, like a piece of content or commercial, and you know, decide like, oh, I don't want this, and move on to something else. So that's why you also see an upward trend for people in Generation Z using things like Pandora or Spotify, having those. You can have a subscription, like a paid subscription with no commercials or ads or anything like that, and more Generation Z people from that population are subscribing to services with no ads because it's a waste of their time. So something else that uh, Generation Z is kind of notorious for is their instant gratification, and that kind of also comes along with the quote unquote short attention span, where they're able to look through everything and say, no, 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 this is not what I want, this is not what I want, this is what I want, and they want it now. And one of the downfalls with that, though, is that they search, they have Google at their fingertips, so they can search for the answer that they want, even though it might not be the correct answer. And something else that is particularly interesting is that Generation Z has a very low media literacy. And what that means is that they have had the internet basically customized around them and their needs and wants and interests. So their usage of the internet is or their usage of media is geared, it's very niche, it's geared toward what they want. So they haven't expanded their view towards all the other possibilities because everything is so solely focused on a customizable world for them. And then, so some of the other traits that Generation Z has, some of the not so good ones, is that I'm sure you've all heard of the incredibly high anxiety rates that Generation Z has, to the point where it's gotten bad. People have started to take medication for it, and it can also become attached to certain objects, like having anxiety with phones or not getting an answer right away, like the instant gratification. Like that can cause anxiety, unknown factors about the future, things of that nature. And then another unfortunate thing that is kind of connected with the high anxiety rates is that the rate of suicide has gone up in this generation. But on the flip side, a positive thing that this generation has as a trait is very high social justice trait. They are not afraid to really advocate for what they believe in, and we need more social justice warriors in the world anyway. And then something else that they are kind of known for is questioning authority, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they're just defiant and not willing to listen to authority, but questioning authority. So maybe a Generation Z person will look at a Generation X or a millennial or somebody like that and question why they're doing something a certain way. So maybe saying something along the lines of, well, so I know that this is the way that it's always been done, but is there a better way that we can do it? Or is there a different way that we can do it? Just kind of like challenging that norm that older generations have set up and saying, well, but can we do better? Or is there a different way? So something else, moving on from that, is that Generation Z populations are that population is very focused on having a side hustle. And that, to us, means maybe working at a fast food restaurant or walking dogs or being a babysitter. Those are kind of like the classic traditional examples. But they are very oriented towards making their money and being successful in that way. For example, I was talking to a business professor here at Western, who told me about a student of his who was making money on the side online by buying high-end tennis shoes and selling them for more than they were worth online, and he was able to make enough of a profit to pay for his entire tuition here at Western. He put himself through college just by buying shoes and selling them for more than they're worth online. And many other students uh, who pay their own way through college will do something similar to that in order to make their money. Um, and that kind of ties into the next thing is that Generation Z, uh, that population is very focused on what's going to get them a job right out of college. College used to be about, at least in older generations, going and pursuing something that you were passionate about or something that you thought you were interested in. And the difference with Generation Z is that they see those passion projects as their side hustles. So, they will go to college and get a degree in something that is going to get them a job. And then for the thing that maybe they are passionate about or interested in on the side, they can do through volunteering or, through a side business, something more part time. So they're definitely more focused on what's going to get me a job right out of college. And then something else that's pretty admirable about Generation Z is that they are, when they do enter the workplace, they want to make a change. That's kind of one of their goals is they want to change the world. They want to produce, they want to do work that's going to make a difference. Um, and so another thing that I've noticed as a trend in the Generation Z is that there's not a lot of face-to-face interaction. Like how they interact with their peers is very centered around media and texting, social media. It's more virtual than it is face-to-face. And then one of the other things too that's very interesting about Generation Z is that it has a very high diversity rate. With the increase of biracial couples, bicultural couples, it's producing a very large amount of diverse people in this generation, and that's something that this generation has actually grown to value is diversity. And so that's something that they kind of hold to their core, their values. Uh, and then kind of moving into college and how Generation Z sees college, it's very interesting. About, roughly 89% of people in Generation Z do value college and think that it's a good thing. They think that, they do recognize that getting a degree, like a post-secondary degree, is kind of essential to entering the job market. And even if it's going to community college and then transferring, like they do have a plan for higher education and they see its value, but they always have a backup plan, because they like to be prepared for their future. So even though college is something that they see and that they value, it's not necessarily their first priority.